right. Hello. Welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. It's been a minute. Let's just see if everything's working here. It seems like it is. And if you're here and you want to drop something in the chat to let me know that you're hearing what I'm saying, that would be great. But yeah, let's make sure that this is all correctly set up. It's not right now. It shows you haven't done it in a while. I spent some time trying to organize the layout here, and all for naught because I messed it up at the last minute. So sorry about that. But welcome back anyway. I'm excited to be here with you tonight and talking about this pretty famous text, What is an Author by Michel Foucault. And this is something I'm teaching in my communication criticism class. We're looking at this piece together, and we're looking at it as part of a section on how to criticize text as opposed to audio or visual stuff. Texts are kind of both in some sense. We look at them in order to read them, and if you read something aloud to someone, that's still the text. But maybe a text has a certain kind of quality to it that needs its own way of being approached. And that's what this piece is about. It's about one of the ways that we all pretty much approach texts, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. We approach them through a question of who wrote it? Who's the author of this text? And if you don't pay attention to that, you might get kicked out of school for plagiarism. Or you might get kicked out of school as the president of university, as Claudine Gay recently did. As the president of Harvard, okay, she resigned, but we all know that she was forced to resign for plagiarism accusation. So these questions of authorship and authority, those words are related, have like these deep questions about how we relate, not just to the lofty questions of philosophy or things like that, but pretty everyday stuff. It will come up whenever we're dealing with the text. And this essay is interesting in its own right for that very question, because the author of this text is Michel Foucault. But what exactly is this text? Oh, aliens, what's up? It's been a long time. Good to see you. Very good to hear from you. The object of this text, or what this text is very interesting. So beforehand, I was looking around at some places. I wonder if you can see this. I was trying to figure out what the original text was. And doing the rounds in another galaxy, nice. What was the original one? And I found that there are all of these things I didn't know about it. I should have done this before I assigned it. Which is, on the one hand, this text that we're reading, this English language text, has been translated 3 different times. But there's also 2 different things that are being translated. The 2 texts are translated separately. Because there was first a lecture that he gave in France, and then there was a lecture that he gave in Buffalo, New York. And I believe that one was in English. And so there's 2 different versions. And there's also some stuff that's left out of the different versions, so they're not exactly the same. And there's also a kind of conversation that happens after the interview in one of them, which I thought was really interesting. I went and found this other version of the text where some of that conversation is included at the very end. Let me kind of go down to it. And there's some very famous people in this conversation. So there's Michel Foucault answering questions. And then there's Lucien Goldman and some people. But also Jacques Lacan. If you're a psychoanalysis person, you might know this name. He comes up here at the very end. It's the very interesting, weird question that he has at the end that doesn't have an answer to it. How apropos. And so the question we might ask here is, first of all, which text are we talking about when we talk about who is an author? Is it the English language one or the French one? Or which version, which translation? And of those translations, which is it a version of? 2 different talks. There's all these questions that are in there. And, well, these are things that Jacques Lacan said or things that Lucien Goldman said that someone wrote down. Are they the authors of this text? So even in this pretty famous argument about what is an author, we're getting already some complications with this very text. What actually is it? But anyway, this is the one that I'm going to read tonight. This is, I think, the one that's kind of most popular here. Or maybe I should say one more thing, which is another interesting thing is that, and I was looking for the original, and I found a very recently published 2019 version of this text in French, text presentation and commentary. And the write-up here says, in France, this text, which is very famous in the United States, is barely known at all. Nobody even knows. So Foucault is very famous, but nobody really knows this particular thing. So they also have different kinds of reception histories here involved in this text, which I thought was very interesting. All of that to say is that when we ask the question of who is an author of something, it usually feels very obvious. You just look at the cover. You just look at what it says. But once we start to examine how that got there and who produced a text, there's all sorts of other questions that come up. And Foucault is doing this for his own reasons, and that's what we're going to look at as we read it, is, well, why ask this question in the first place? What's at stake here is not so obvious at first, but let's take a look. So here we go. Michel Foucault, what is an author? 1969. In proposing this slightly, let me make sure that this is at least visible. Man, I really thought I was going to have this nicely set up for today, and then I just didn't do a good job at that. Okay. Well, anyway, that should work. Sort of. Yeah. In proposing this slightly odd question, I am conscious of the need for an explanation. To this day, the author remains an open question, both with respect to its general function within discourse and in my own writings. That is, the question permits me to return to certain aspects of my own work, which now appear ill-advised and misleading. So he's thinking about his own work as a writer, and he's kind of trying to correct some of those ideas. Well, that already kind of shows one of the functions of the author that he's going to talk about, or kind of problematize. In this regard, I wish to propose a necessary criticism and reevaluation. For instance, my objective in The Order of Things, so this is a famous book that he read, and if you're in my class, you've also read a very small portion of this book, the introduction of this book, which is called The Order of Things in English, and in French, the title would be Words and Things. So we also have two different titles for this text, where he's talking about epistemes, or epistemes, however you want to pronounce it, different orders of knowledge, the kind of background of knowledge, the structure of knowledge that has its own history, that's a different history than, say, just the history of a scientific invention. Okay, so this is a big, massive project that he did. My objective in The Order of Things had been to analyze verbal clusters as discursive layers which fall outside the familiar categories of a book, a work, or an author. But while I considered natural history, the analysis of wealth, and political economy in general terms, I neglected a similar analysis of the author and his works. It is perhaps due to this omission that I employed the names of authors throughout the book in a naive and often crude fashion. I spoke of Buffon, Cuvier, Ricardo. So this is someone who did natural history. This is someone who was kind of involved in what we may call early biology, and this is someone who is involved in political economy, and others as well, but failed to realize that I had allowed their names to function ambiguously. This has proved an embarrassment to me in that my oversight has served to raise two pertinent objections. It was argued that I had not properly described Buffon or his work, and that my handling of Marx, this is Karl Marx, was pitifully inadequate in terms of the totality of his thought. Although these objections were obviously justified, they ignored the task I had set myself. I had no intention of describing Buffon or Marx, or of reproducing their statements or implicit meanings, but simply stated, I wanted to locate the rules that formed a certain number of concepts and theoretical relationships in their works. So what's going on here, you might imagine it as something like this. If someone's really interested in analyzing a play, let's say in a sports game, they're like, someone really wants to talk about plays, various kinds of inbounds plays, let's say in basketball. Should we do a stack or something like this? And someone might be like, yeah, well, are you talking about the Knicks doing it? Or are you talking about, I don't know, the Golden State Warriors doing it? And someone's like, oh, I'm not interested in whose version of this is. I'm just interested in the play itself. We're talking about two different kinds of abstract objects. But when we talk about authors, it's very weird for people to say, we're like, well, I'm just interested in an idea in their work. I'm not interested in them saying it. That's kind of the move that Foucault is trying to make, which is it is kind of weird. And so this is what he's trying to do, is this backtracking to explain why he wanted to do that. In addition, it was argued that I had created monstrous families by bringing together names as disparate as Buffon and Linnaeus, or in placing Cuvier next to Darwin in defiance of the most readily observable family resemblances and natural ties. Be like, this is evolution, and this is pre-evolutionary, sort of, whatever. This objection also seems inappropriate, since I had never tried to establish a genealogical table of exceptional individuals, nor was I concerned in forming an intellectual daguerreotype. Here's kind of being funny. A daguerreotype is this very old-timey version of photography. He's like, this is what people expected me to do, is all this old-timey stuff. That, if you read certain kinds of histories, intellectual histories or histories of ideas, it's just this kind of stream of names of like, then there was Isaac Newton, and then there was Leibniz, and then there was And he's like, yeah, he's right, you're right. I didn't do that. So people were upset. In fact, I had no intention of forming any family, whether holy or perverse. He's being witty here too. On the contrary, I wanted to determine, a much more modest task, the functional conditions of specific discursive practices. Then why did I use the names of authors in the order of things? Why not avoid their use altogether? Or short of that, why not define the manner in which they were used? These questions appear fully justified, and I have tried to gauge their implications and consequences in a book that will appear shortly. Okay, and then the footnotes tells us something. Should we go look at the footnote? Why not? Let's go see. Does the footnote include it here? I forget. It's not in this terrible PDF. Another problem of text today, which is, which electronic version of the text do you have? Which may not include all of the things that the text, maybe the official text, would have. Oh well. These questions have determined my effort to situate... I have another version of this actually here, which I could use, but this is the one I assigned. So, these questions have determined my effort to situate comprehensive discursive units, such as natural history or political economy, and to establish the methods and instruments for delimiting, analyzing, and describing these unities. I mean, maybe one of the easier ways to say, well, what's the unity here? You might say, oh, this is a certain kind of study or field of knowledge or something like that. And he also wants to avoid saying that because he doesn't want to make too many assumptions, but that's kind of what he's doing. Nevertheless, as a privileged moment of individualization in the history of ideas, knowledge, and literature, or in the history of philosophy and science, the question of the author demands a more direct response. Even now, when we study the history of a concept, a literary genre, or a branch of philosophy, these concerns assume a relatively weak and secondary position in relation to the solid and fundamental role of an author and his works. So, I encounter this kind of in the sort of scholarship that I do, which is, for instance, I'm interested in something like melancholy, what people mean when they said melancholy at a certain moment in time. But I'm not that interested in what any particular person says. And I ran up against a lot of issues in trying to work this way, of being like, well, I'm trying to kind of take all of these different statements and put them together and see if anything if there's any texture there or tensions between what they say. And that's what I'm interested in. And some people who I was working with would say things like, yeah, but you have to kind of give each of the works that you're talking about its own due. You can't just kind of take a quotation out of it and talk about it. You have to talk about the whole work every time. You have to talk about it as a unity. And I didn't want to do that. So in some sense, I'm pretty sympathetic to what Foucault is doing here. He's trying to say, well, can we talk about objects of discourse without always saying that the framework of it has to be, well, it come from this book or this work or this author? Could we talk about it and cut it up in different ways? And it's not so easy to do that, but why not? Why is there so much resistance to that? For the purposes of this paper, I will set aside a socio-historical analysis of the author as an individual and the numerous questions that deserve attention in this context. How the author was individualized in a culture such as ours. The status we have given the author, for instance, when we began our research into authenticity and attribution. The systems of valorization in which he was included. Well, so he's doing this thing here called the royal we. He's like, when we began our research, he's talking about himself. Yeah. The systems of valorization in which he was included, or the moment when the stories of heroes gave way to an author's biography. The conditions that fostered the formulation of the fundamental critical category of the man and his work. For the time being, I wish to restrict myself to the singular relationship that holds between an author and a text, the manner in which a text apparently points to this figure who is outside and precedes it. Beckett. Here he's talking about Samuel Beckett, who is also an interesting figure in light of these different English and French versions of this text. Samuel Beckett was an Irish writer, but he lived a lot of his life in France, and he wrote in French, and often he would write a text in French, and then he would translate it back into English himself. He translated himself. So this is also what we're reading here is probably originally in French, even though he's an Irish writer who also wrote it probably in English at some other point. Beckett supplies a direction. What matter who's speaking? Someone said. What matter who's speaking? And this comes from a text that Beckett wrote. It's a fictional text. I think it's something like Stories for Nothing or something like that. Tales for Nothing. And in one of these, he kind of puts together all these different voices, but the voices don't have any names or they're not attributed to anyone, and you're not really any kind of real space or world where you could figure out who they are, but you just still can sense the difference between the voices. And so this is maybe what the direction is here. That voices might be, or there might be something that could be distinguished as different kinds of unities without there being an author. In an indifference such as this, we must recognize one of the fundamental ethical principles of contemporary writing. It is not simply ethical because it characterizes our way of speaking and writing, but because it stands as an immanent rule, endlessly adopted and yet never fully applied. As a principle, it dominates writing as an ongoing practice and slights our customary attention to the finished product. So again, if you're in my class and you're writing in your diary, as you should be doing, very good, that sense of like all of this stuff that's coming out, being like, well, am I the author of this text? What about when I write one more sentence? Am I now the author of this text? The author kind of comes in only once the whole thing is supposedly done. When something's kind of finished, be like, oh, well, they authored this text. Are you an author before you've written, as you're writing, and all these other moments? So there's a little bit of complexity there just about time. You can also think about all the authors of unfinished texts, like Kafka's novels, world historical famous author. Well, he never finished any of those novels, and he told them not to publish any of them, told the executor of his will, Max Brod, not to publish these works. But they did. But now we read them as works, as finished texts, because they're published in a certain way. So, there are all sorts of weird things that come up with different examples. For the sake of illustration, we need only consider two of its major themes. First, the writing of our day has freed itself from the necessity of expression. It only refers to itself, yet it is not restricted to the confines of interiority. On the contrary, we recognize it in its exterior deployment. So here, when he's talking about the writing of our day, he's probably referring to a literary movement at the time, which Alain Robbe-Grillet maybe is the most famous exponent of, which would called something like in French, like the new novel, which was, we're just going to describe the literal objective surface of things. We're not going to engage in any kind of psychology or any interiority of the characters. So that's probably what he's talking about here. So this reversal transforms writing into an interplay of signs, regulated less by the content it signifies than by the very nature of the signifier. So it's all on the surface. There's no kind of techniques that give you the sense of depth. So if in painting, there was kind of this moment in where you had painting, you had perspective and Italian painting that gave you the illusion of depth. At a certain moment, painters start painting just flat on the canvas. They're not trying to do that anymore. So there's a similar kind of thing happening in the writing of this moment that he thinks is pretty interesting, I guess. Moreover, it implies an action that is always testing the limits of its regularity, transgressing and reversing an order that it accepts and manipulates. Writing unfolds like a game that inevitably moves beyond its own rules and finally leaves them behind. Thus, the essential basis of this writing is not the exalted emotions related to the act of composition. In the English tradition, this is Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads, the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. I think this is probably much more familiar as an idea of creative writing that we have than something like Robbe-Grillet's weird novels, which are closer in time to us, but still maybe more foreign. This idea of, I get this burst of inspiration and I write. That's kind of the thing that is being troubled by this new ethic or approach to writing. There's no such thing as the essential base of this writing is not those exalted emotions related to the act of composition or the insertion of a subject into language. This would be like lyrical poetry. I sing my soul. I tell you, I sing the song of myself with Walt Whitman. Rather, it is primarily concerned with creating an opening where the writing subject endlessly disappears. So this new form of writing shows that you can write in a way where who or what is speaking, what's the position from what things are being said, can never be seen. It's always opaque. Okay. This does get a little bit more interesting as it goes on. It kind of starts in this slow, meandering way, which is a little bit of Foucault's style, making me I'm kind of less attracted to this as I get older than I used to be, this kind of style that he has. But oh well, alas. He's good ideas, I think. The second theme is even more familiar. It is the kinship between writing and death. This relationship inverts the age-old conception of Greek narrative or epic, which was designed to guarantee the immortality of a hero. The hero accepted an early death because his life, consecrated and magnified by death, passed into immortality. And the narrative redeemed his acceptance of death. Now, you might be like, oh yeah, this is a familiar theme. I've never heard about this before. Okay, so this is, maybe to his audience this is more familiar. But this is something that you see all over Greek epics. So one of the Greek words that appears a lot in these epics is kleos, which means a certain kind of glory. But it's the glory of attributed to someone in a song. So you will hear the songs of Achilles and the wrath of Achilles. And so this idea of immortality being secured because the song will live on. The song will go on. Celine Dion you can think of, or you can think of Shakespeare's sonnets, where one of his famous sonnets, he says, this poem will last longer, and this is a way of loving someone. This idea that we get to kind of live past our lives through being immortalized in a text of some kind, well, maybe a discourse or a song, and then eventually a text, takes on a new sense with authorship. So in a different sense, Arabic stories, and the Arabian Nights in particular, had as their motivation, their theme and pretext, the strategy for defeating death. Storytellers continued their narratives late into the night to forestall death and to delay the inevitable moment when everyone must fall silent. Scheherazade's story is a desperate inversion of murder. It is the effort throughout all those nights to exclude death from the circle of existence. You have to know a little bit about the Arabian Nights for any of this to make sense. So the way that the Arabian Nights was, it's very interesting. It's not really a text. It's kind of a tradition, which has many different textual variants in many different languages. So it's a very interesting thing to think with as an example for this kind of question. Is the Arabian Nights a book? Who authored it? That kind of stuff. But the way that it works is that there's this kind of evil king who's taking the rights of his subjects, to sleep with women before they're married, and then he has them executed before they can be married. And so he does this every night. He's just this kind of evil, cruel villain. And there's this woman, Scheherazade, who gets, winds up in his clutches, and she says, okay, well, you could kill me tonight, or instead what you could do is, I'm going to tell you a story. And she'll kind of tell the story, and he's like, oh, but I want to hear more of the story. She's like, well, you have to come back another night. You have to invite me back to your bedroom. So it's 1,001 nights. He keeps wanting to hear the stories. So it's this kind of frame tale around all of these different stories that belong to this tradition, which grew over many centuries, really. That means that the kind of continuing of the text of the narrative of the tale was the delaying of death. Okay, so that's what Foucault is playing off of here, this idea. This conception of a spoken or written narrative as a protection against death has been transformed by our culture. Writing is now linked to sacrifice and to the sacrifice of life itself. It is a voluntary obliteration of the self that does not require representation in books, because it takes place in the everyday existence of the writer. So we don't need, he's making a weird argument here, so we don't need this kind of frame tale about, we're going to delay death by being preserved in a text, or the saying of a story will keep us from it. The writer themselves sacrifices their life in the writing. Where a work had the duty of creating immortality, it now attains the right to kill, to become the murderer of its author. Flaubert, Proust, and Kafka are obvious examples of this reversal. So what he's doing here is, he's like, again, these are obvious examples. You have to know quite a bit about these authors that he's saying are he's apologizing for even mentioning, but we can take Proust for one instance of this. Marcel Proust, who's kind of famous for his many novels about his life, I don't know all of this perfectly. This is not my wheelhouse. So if I get something wrong here, you can go be angry in the comments. but something like this. He checked himself into a hotel, had the hotel walls kind of boarded up with cork, so it was very quiet in there, and kind of was maybe, we might call him a hypochondriac, and thought he was kind of dying of tuberculosis, and wrote these beautiful, beautiful novels about his life that kind of, went into this incredible detail, a new kind of novel of his life. So the actual writing of a text takes something out of you, as people say. My blood, sweat, and tears on the page, to the point that, some of these writers who devoted themselves to being authors killed themselves in the process from their efforts. So this is one thing that Foucault thinks this is really important to begin with. I find it to be a very strange place to go. This is really not what I think about when I think about these essays. This essay is all of the stuff that he begins with. But anyway, you maybe can make up your mind as why he thinks it's important to talk about this at first when we go on with the argument. In addition, we find the link between writing and death manifested in the total effacement of the individual characteristics of the writer. The quibbling and confrontations that a writer generates between himself and his text cancel out the signs of his particular individuality. If we wish to know the writer in our day, it will be through the singularity of his absence and in his link to death, which has transformed him into a victim of his own writing. So here he's being kind of coy, I think, because we have a tendency to read a text and say, oh, well, this is the author expressing themselves. This is the author saying what they think. And he's like, no, what makes someone an author is exactly that you can't tell that. You don't see all their drafts. You don't see all their notes and their nights where they're pulling their hair out and they're trying to work it out. The fact that the author only emerges once the text is complete means you don't really see the author at all. The text kind of stands in for the author in a weird way. If we wish to know, while all of this is familiar in philosophy, as in literary criticism, I'm not certain that the consequences derived from the disappearance or death of the author have been fully explored, or that the importance of the event has been appreciated. So this idea of the death of the author is, in some sense, a response to a kind of conversation that's going on with those people like Robbe-Grillet, as I mentioned before, and also another famous scholar, Roland Barthes, who wrote a piece called The Death of the Author. The death of the author here not being the death of some particular author, of course, many authors have died, but saying that, okay, in the new literature that's emerging in this moment, reading it as an expression of an author's thoughts is clearly wrong. That's not the way to read texts. And this is why this stuff is often assigned, I think, in college classes, because I think that's still a surprising idea. It's not the popular way to read text. We still read text by thinking about, well, what did the author mean? And oftentimes people will criticize interpretations of being like, you're saying this and that about the text, but you don't even know what the author thought, so how can you say that? But they're kind of pointing to here is the weirdness of that idea. Well, what would be the moment at which we would see what the author thought? Sometimes people will go to interviews, which is another form of writing usually, or sometimes it's recorded. But what someone says at some place other than the text itself ends up being the truth of it. Well, what if there is no interview? Well, then we can never know. It's a very weird thing. So it gets created by the idea of the author, this assumption that the obvious meaning of a text would be what the author says that it means. And of course, there are many texts that have too many authors, the Bible being a famous one. There's just too many authors. So who would you ask? Which one of the authors would you ask to say what the meaning of the text was? Okay, but stay buckled in, because there are more complications to come. To be specific, it seems to me that the themes destined to replace the privileged position accorded the author have merely served to arrest the possibility of genuine change. Of these, I will examine two that seem particularly important. So now he's saying, okay, these people have said we need to kind of do something new, we need to do something different, but the way that it's been done so far is not, we're just rehashing the same problems that we've been coming up in the past of how to interpret texts. The death of the author has led to the haunting of the author. To begin with, the thesis concerning a work. It has been understood that the task of criticism is not to reestablish the ties between an author and his work, or to reconstitute an author's thought and experience through his works, and further that criticism should concern itself with the structures of a work, its architectonic forms, which are studied for their intrinsic and internal relationships. I'm almost certain that Foucault here is not thinking about new criticism, which is an Anglophone tradition of this, but that would be maybe the Anglophone version of this. The new critics were saying, okay, forget about author biographies, forget about all that stuff, just look at the poem, just look at the story. What can you see about it internally, structurally? That's what you should base your interpretation on. And for them, close reading, which is ostensibly what I do on these streams, is the methodology. We want to read the text closely, understand what it means on its own terms, somehow internally. So that's what he's talking about. That's become established here. He thinks that that's the common sense of his own audience in this time. Again, I think that's probably still pretty far from how most people read today, but that was kind of the consensus of the time. And I would still say it's still kind of an academic consensus. There's the idea of the intentional fallacy, that it's a fallacy to say, well, Blake couldn't have meant that his poem was, or here's a better example, Milton's Paradise Lost. He says in the poem what he's trying to do, to justify the ways of God to man. And it's this long poem about Satan, and Satan and God are in a war, sounds kind of familiar. But many people have read the poem and been like, Satan actually seems kind of right. I mean, Satan seems to have the better of the argument. So then maybe even if Milton meant this to justify God, the poem means something other than that, because the way that it reads is that Satan is more sympathetic. And the intentional fallacy would be to say, nope, that reading is wrong because Milton said so. Why is Milton the authority of the text that he authored? Oh, wait a minute. Okay. So we're in a little bit of a bind here with this question of the author. Yet, what are the contexts that questions the concept of a work? What, in short, is the strange unit designated by the term work? Now, here's like a real useful kind of thing to think about. And as I was saying before, this very document, I'm like, well, is this what is an author, or is it the untranslated version, or which of the two speeches that he gave? What constitutes a work itself is really not obvious. What is necessary to its composition if a work is not something written by a person called an author? Difficulties arise on all sides if we raise the question in this way. If an individual is not an author, what are we to make of those things he has written or said, left among his papers or communicated to others? Is this not properly a work? What, for instance, were Sade's papers before he was consecrated as an author? So this is the Marquis de Sade, who, we get the term sadism from, who wrote all sorts of violent erotica while he was in prison, and just kind of like was and has often been kind of burned or banned as pornography. Well, if someone's just kind of sitting and writing all of their weird fantasies down, is that a work of art if it just kind of goes on endlessly like fan fiction? Well, once someone says, oh, well, Sade is an important author and figure and we publish his works, now it's a work. So that's one of the things that he's pointing to. Little more, perhaps, than rolls of paper on which he endlessly unraveled his fantasies while in prison. I think he was in the Bastille, actually, the famous Bastille that was, Bastille, assuming that we are dealing with an author, is everything that he wrote and said, everything he left behind, to be included in his work? This problem is both theoretical and practical. If we wish to publish the complete works of Nietzsche, for example, where do we draw the line? Certainly everything must be published, but can we agree on what everything means? We will, of course, include everything that Nietzsche himself published, along with drafts of his works, his plans for aphorisms, his marginal notations and corrections. But what if in a notebook filled with aphorisms we find a reference, a remainder of an appointment, an address, or a laundry bill? Should this be included in his works? Why not? Think of this. Maybe if one of you is trying to be a writer, an author, and maybe you write some of your stories in your notes app. You write some of your ideas in your notes app, and someone in the future, they're like, oh, wow, she is so brilliant. We need to publish everything that she wrote. And then they go into your notes app. Would you want all that stuff to be considered your things that you authored? All sorts of things that you wrote in your notes app? That's kind of the question here. Where do we draw the line? What constitutes the complete works of someone? Is every piece of writing of an author a work? These practical considerations are endless. Once we consider how a work can be extracted from the millions of traces left by an individual after his death. Plainly, we lack a theory to encompass the questions generated by a work and the empirical activity of those who naively undertake the publication of the complete works of an author often suffers from the absence of this framework. The German word for this thing that people leave behind is called Nachlass, which means all of their kind of papers and notes that are unpublished. And this is especially in the German tradition, which is why it's a German word. You could send a graduate student in, or someone who needs to write a Habilitationsschrift, and they'll go in and kind of work through all of these person's badly ordered notes and kind of be very diligent with them. And I forget who it was, some famous philosopher, maybe it was Husserl, who was like, no, it wasn't him, but someone was like burned all their stuff. They're like, I don't want anyone to waste their life going through all of my things. Like, I don't want to leave a Nachlass. I don't want to have a literary afterlife. Just like read the stuff that I have. And this tradition of people, like authors, burning their works or letters before they died used to be a much bigger thing. Now, I don't know. I think today we're just like lost in the sauce. There's so much information. It would be hard to even know whether you could delete things that you've written. Like, it might be preserved in an Amazon server farm somewhere, and you don't know. So there's that kind of question, too, of where are these things actually being preserved and kept as texts physically has changed a lot in the digital era. So, like me reading this aloud, is that a version of the text with all this weird commentary and obit or dicta in between? I don't know. Yet more questions arise. Can we say that the Arabian Nights and Stromates of Clement of Alexandria, or the lives of Diogenes Laertes, constitute works? And so one of the things, it's hard to kind of figure out what point he's making here, but we can go off. I don't know too much about this one, except that this is a church father. But these are kind of compilations of stuff. So, and they might be compiled at different moments in time. And so who compiled them might not be the same person that wrote them or is said to have written them. And so you have the problem of, like, someone wrote something and then someone else like put all of that stuff into a volume together and said, well, this is a work. So the person who decides it's a work is different from the person who is the author of the work. That's kind of the point there, or one of the points he's making. Such questions only begin to suggest the range of our difficulties, and if some have found it convenient to bypass the individuality of the writer or his status as an author to concentrate on a work, they have failed to appreciate the equally problematic nature of the word work, in French œuvre, and the unity it designates. Another thesis has detained us from taking full measure of the author's disappearance. It avoids confronting the specific event that makes it possible, and in subtle ways continues to preserve the existence of the author. This is the notion of écriture. So this was like a popular thing that was happening in his time. I don't think it's as important for us to think about it in the terms that he is talking about, but you might think of it this way. Here's a modern analog. ChatGPT might be a way to, like, put in, instead of écriture, put in ChatGPT, and you might get a sense of what the question that they're asking is here. Écriture just literally means writing. So we could talk about someone's writings as like discrete things, but what about just writing that just kind of continues, that doesn't have a specific end or beginning point? That's kind of what we're talking about here, like ChatGPT. Strictly speaking, it should allow us not only to circumvent references to an author, but to situate his recent absence. The conception of écriture as currently employed is concerned with neither the act of writing nor the indications as symptoms or signs within a text of an author's meaning. Rather, it stands for the remarkably profound attempt to elaborate the conditions of any text, both the conditions of its spatial dispersion and its temporal deployment. So, again, going back to ChatGPT, if I was like, okay, ChatGPT, write me a horror story. Is ChatGPT the author of the horror story? I'm like, okay, maybe a horror story about the Olsen twins eating too much rice. Okay, that's my prompt. And then they write it, but I didn't write it. And ChatGPT isn't an author in any conventional sense. So who wrote the text? Like, is the text authored at all? And now we're in this weird thing because it can read like a pretty weird horror story about the Olsen twins eating too much rice. But yeah, why was that what I went to? I don't know. What does that say about me? Oh well. I'm like looking around my room for random stuff. That's why. It appears, however, that this concept as currently employed has merely transposed the empirical characteristics of an author to a transcendental anonymity. Transcendental anonymity, ChatGPT. The extremely visible signs of the author's empirical activity are effaced to allow the play, in parallel or opposition, of religious and critical modes of characterization. So he's distinguishing there between religious and critical modes of characterization. Why is that going to be important? Well, I mentioned the Bible before. I said that the Bible had many different authors to it, and that is the point of view of a critical analysis of the Bible. You could say that begins around the 17th century, where people are looking at the Bible as a historical text and trying to figure out, who, maybe not to the individual level, but what groups authored it. So one of the famous findings of biblical criticism is that in the Hebrew Bible, there's two different kinds of textual traditions: the Yahwist tradition and the Elohist tradition, which are named for two different names for God, Yahweh and Elohim. So these are two textual traditions that have like different attitudes and different time periods that get combined into single texts and kind of appear in the same book and things like that. So that's one of the things that we might say is that's a critical analysis. From the religious point of view of the text, you'd be like, well, God is the author of the text, or Moses is the author of the text. And that would kind of give us a different way of reading it. In granting a primordial status to writing, do we not, in effect, simply reinscribe in transcendental terms the theological affirmation of its sacred origin, or a critical belief in its creative nature? To say that writing, in terms of the particular history it made possible, is subjected to forgetfulness and repression, is this not to reintroduce in transcendental terms the religious principle of hidden meanings, which require interpretation, and the critical assumption of implicit significations, silent purposes, and obscure contents, which give rise to commentary? So one of the other things I read kind of before coming on stream was later on when Foucault again gave another lecture at the Collège de France, this time relating to this, he amended his position here in saying, actually, commentary is a different kind of thing than authorship. And so he started to talk about commentary as doing something else, which we can't really get into. But here I think he's taking a little bit of a shot. He's kind of subtweeting psychoanalysis here. And as I said, Jacques Lacan was in the audience. Jacques Lacan was the big daddy of French psychoanalysis at that time. So here he's kind of saying, like, oh yeah, if you want to psychoanalyze a text, that might seem like new and you're not kind of basing it on the author, but by saying like, oh, well, there's a meaning behind or underneath the text, you're really going back to this, we're always going back to this religious modality of like, well, the text is really saying something other than what we see that it says. There are these other silent purposes that the text kind of carries along. So he's trying to take aim at that a little bit and point out that that's a common thing amongst schools of interpretation or thought that might seem very different, like religious, creative criticism, like literary criticism and psychoanalysis. They might have similarities in where they posit the text, real meaning as underneath or beyond or below or something like that. Finally, is not the conception of writing as absence a transposition into transcendental terms of the religious belief in a fixed and continuous tradition? So when people are like, well, the Bible says this, and it's like, well, the Bible has meant many different things to different communities all throughout history. But for some people, to acknowledge that would be a violation of their religious position. Like there's one unitary meaning of the Bible, a fixed and continuous tradition. And that proclaims the survival of the work as a kind of enigmatic supplement of the author beyond his own death. This conception of écriture sustains the privileges of the author through the safeguard of the a priori. The a priori is like what we can know before we even look at anything. Like, I know that even before anybody watches this stream, that this is a difficult piece. No, okay, that's not really a priori. But like, I know that I'm in space without having to open. I can close my eyes and still I'm still in space even though I'm not looking around anywhere. That's an a priori thing. So the play of representations that formed a particular image of the author is extended within a gray neutrality. The disappearance of the author, since Mallarmé, an event of our time, is held in check by the transcendental. So here again, most of this is kind of he's arguing with an argument that's like not really alive to us right now, which is, so some people are like, the author lives, yay, long live the author. This is the very traditional view that a text expresses what the author says. And there were these other people being like, no, not the author, but writing itself. And writing has its own kind of meaning that we can get to without reference to the author. And he's like, yeah, but when we do this, we kind of always go to this idea of like, we've just put another word in for the author. The thing that you are calling writing creates a similar kind of position or similar kind of move of which is this transcendental meaning of the text. And so he's trying to say, like, yeah, you thought you got rid of the author, but the author's coming back. The author haunts you. Is it not necessary to draw a line between those who believe that we can continue to situate our present discontinuities within the historical and transcendental tradition of the 19th century, and those who are making a great effort to liberate themselves once and for all from this conceptual framework? All right. I think that that's kind of a slow and a little bit rough beginning to this essay, but that's how he begins. It is obviously insufficient to repeat empty slogans. The author has disappeared. God and man died a common death. So, of course, this is referring to Nietzsche's famous line, God is dead, which, it must be said, in German rhymes. Gott ist tot. So it doesn't kind of work as well when you translate it. But God and man have died a common death. The God is dead, the author is also dead. What did Nietzsche mean when he said God is dead? He wasn't just saying that God doesn't exist. Probably he would also agree with that claim. But rather that, like, the function of God, of how God functioned in people's lives and minds and society and the world, that no longer worked. So even when people believed in God and said things about God, the function of God had changed. And that's kind of what Foucault is about to do. He's going to go from the author to the author function. That there's a function of the author, or the position of the author, that continues even at the point that the author is dead. Rather, we should re-examine the empty space left by the author's disappearance. We should attentively observe along its gaps and fault lines, its new demarcations, and the reapportionment of this void. We should await the fluid functions released by this disappearance. In this context, we can briefly consider the problems that arise in the use of an author's name. What is the name of an author? How does it function? Far from offering a solution, I will attempt to indicate some of the difficulties related to these questions. I think we can actually do better than Foucault here now by thinking very practically and concretely with the questions that come up with ChatGPT. So, at what point can you use ChatGPT and then take something and put your name on it and say that you did it? And there's not a simple answer to that question. But bringing that question up maybe tells us something about what we actually think the name, putting a name to something and saying, I've authored this text, or this person has authored this text, would entail. We can see it in the negative case more clearly, being like, well, you can't just slap your name on whatever ChatGPT produces. But, well, what if I use ChatGPT to, like, correct a piece of writing that I've already done? How much of it has to be mine? And then we're in these conundrums that are real ones that people are actually having. There's this thing called Chat Zero, is it? Which is this kind of algorithm that's supposed to detect the use of ChatGPT or algorithmic writing. And I think this is probably a really dangerous thing for people to use in this kind of simple and naive way, being like, oh, well, you used ChatGPT, you cheated, you plagiarized, you're out. For instance, what if you use ChatGPT to translate something? Like, let's say English is not your first language and you have to write in English. You just have to translate it. How do we know what the algorithm is detecting as being kind of like, we just really don't know what we're talking about here. So we do actually kind of need, I think, a theory, maybe not Foucault's theory, but something like what Foucault is trying to do to help answer our questions about what it means to say that a text is authored today in light of new technologies. The name of an author poses all the problems related to the category of the proper name. Here I'm referring to the work of John Searle, among others. So John Searle was an American philosopher who was very interested in proper nouns. That's true. I don't know what else to tell you. Obviously not a pure and simple reference. The proper name, and the author's name as well, has other than indicative functions. So you might say, what's the indicative function of a name? Well, that's what refers to you. My niece, her name is Marion. And so I can tell someone else, be like, okay, that's how you refer to her. But I can also say, Marion, come over here. And then I'm calling her. I'm pleading with her. I'm not just referring to her. I'm kind of doing something else. Or we could like sing her name, Marion the librarian. There are all sorts of things that names can do other than just refer to something. But he's not thinking of the weird examples I just did. He's going to think of his own weird examples. It is more than a gesture, a finger pointed at someone. It is, to a certain extent, the equivalent of a description. When we say Aristotle, we are using a word that means one or a series of definite descriptions of the type, the author of the Analytics, or the founder of ontology, and so forth. So the idea of the name here, and this is what he's getting from Searle, is that what the name does is it can be replaced with other descriptions, and therefore the name is actually functioning as a description of something. Well, what exactly is it describing when it's the name of an author? That's what Foucault's trying to do here. Furthermore, a proper name has other functions than that of signification. When we discover that Rimbaud has not written La Chasse Spirituelle, Rimbaud is another French poet, we cannot maintain that the meaning of the proper name or this author's name has been altered. The proper name and the name of the author oscillate between the poles of description and designation, and granting that they are linked to what they name, they are not totally determined either by their descriptive or designative functions. I know it's very confusing. I'm going to keep going because I think he gives a better example in the next paragraph that might be a little bit clearer, and we can talk about that one. Yeah, and it is here that the specific difficulties attending an author's name appear. The link between a proper name and the individual being named, and the link between an author's name and that which it names are not isomorphous and do not function in the same way. And these differences require clarification. So what he's saying is, even though we'll talk about it more later, if we took someone like Aristotle, if I'm referring to Aristotle as a proper name, not as Aristotle the author, I might be able to say all sorts of things about him and his life. But when I'm referring to Aristotle as an author, I am referring to him as the author of his works. So if it turned out that Aristotle didn't write any of those works, the meaning of his name as an author would change, even if the person we were referring to remained the same. It's a subtle point, but maybe the next example will make it clear. To learn, for example, that Pierre Dupont does not have blue eyes, does not live in Paris, and is not a doctor, does not invalidate the fact that the name Pierre Dupont continues to refer to the same person. So we can kind of learn new things about people or make errors about people, but the name's reference doesn't change. Okay. There's been no modification of the designation that links the name to the person. With the name of an author, however, the problems are far more complex. The disclosure that Shakespeare was not born in the house that tourists now visit would not modify the functioning of the author's name. That would not. So be like, okay, he wasn't born in this house. Oh, okay, well, but it's still Shakespeare the author. But if it were proved that he had not written the sonnets that we attribute to him, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? This would constitute a significant change and affect the manner in which the author's name functions. Moreover, if we establish that Shakespeare wrote Bacon's Organon, this is Francis Bacon, so oftentimes people who are interested in this stupid kind of scholarship that tries to disprove that Shakespeare ever wrote any of his works, and really it was Francis Bacon. There are a bunch of hacks and quacks who do this kind of thing, and there's a little cottage industry of books that people buy about this. Well, here he's going the reverse thing. Well, let's say Shakespeare actually wrote Francis Bacon's stuff, the Organon, and that the same author was responsible for both the works of Shakespeare and those of Bacon. We would have introduced a third type of alteration, which completely modifies the functioning of the author's name. Consequently, the name of an author is not precisely a proper name among others. So this is a long argument to try to make a very fine distinction between the name of the person and the name of the author. Again, very subtle, but I think it is important. Hopefully that makes it somewhat clear, at least. Many other factors sustain this paradoxical singularity of the name of an author. It is altogether different to maintain that Pierre Dupont does not exist, and that Homer or Hermes Trismegistes have never existed. Okay, I'm going to talk about who Homer and Hermes Trismegistes is, because here, this actually does matter to the argument. Homer is the author of what? The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also all sorts of other things that we don't have extant with us. But as Giambattista Vico in the 18th century, he's like, the true discovery of Homer. He's like, the true discovery of Homer is that Homer didn't exist. Homer was not a person. Homer is a tradition where people attribute things and poems to this one character. Well, even when Vico makes his discovery of Homer, which more recent research has kind of supported, that doesn't mean that Homer, as the name of an author, ceases to function. Like, it doesn't really matter that much if Homer as a person didn't exist. We're still going to say that Homer is the author of the Odyssey. Hermes Trismegistes, it's a kind of weird and interesting one, is the supposed like kind of legendary and sort of magical author of the magical tradition in Europe and Arab it's the Arab countries. So works like the Picatrix. You're not going to know these works. That's fine. But the idea, people would attribute all of these different magical works to this one guy, and he definitely didn't exist. He's like a magical, legendary kind of figure, but there are some texts that are attributed to this tradition and some that are not. So it still functions as the name of an author, even though no person named Hermes Hermes never existed. So, but if you said that somebody, like let's say Francis Ford Coppola, never existed, or referring to him as a person, or if you said Timothy Barr, that's my name, never existed, be like, okay, well then that name doesn't refer to anything. It's just made up. While the first negation merely implies that there is no one by the name of Pierre Dupont, the second indicates that several individuals have been referred to by one name, or that the real author possessed none of the traits traditionally associated with Homer or Hermes. Neither is it the same thing to say that Jacques Durand, not Pierre Dupont, is the real name of X. So this person would be like, no, that's not Sophie, that's Becca. Oh, I'm so sorry, I got your name wrong. Okay, that's a different kind of thing. And that Stendhal's name was Henri Beyle. So Stendhal is a French novelist, but that's his pen name. Henri Beyle is his like real name, just like we have Mark Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens. Okay, that's the same thing of mistaking Becca for Mitzi or whatever. We could also examine the function and meaning of such statements as Bourbaki is this or that person. Bourbaki is a group of people who authored a bunch of mathematical textbooks. So they all write under the same name, even though they're different individuals. So you could read a paper by Bourbaki and be like, oh, well, which one of them wrote it? So the author is Bourbaki, but the individuals could be one of 8 or 9 different people. And Victor Eremita, Climacus, Anticlimacus, Frater Taciturnus, Constantine Constantius, all of these are Kierkegaard. So this is another guy who wrote under many different pen names. So Bourbaki is a bunch of guys all writing under one name, and then Kierkegaard is one guy writing under many different names. And they all kind of actually are a little bit different in their attitudes. Kierkegaard was a weird guy. Also, Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, also did this. He had many different pen names, and they were all different authors because they had different styles and opinions and philosophies in these different names that he created. These differences indicate that an author's name is not simply an element of speech, as a subject, a complement, or an element that could be replaced by a pronoun or other parts of speech. Its presence is functional in that it serves as a means of classification. A name can group together a number of texts and thus differentiate them from others. A name also establishes different forms of relationships among texts. Neither Hermes nor Hippocrates existed in the sense that we can say Balzac existed, who's a 19th century French novelist. But the fact that a number of texts were attached to a single name implies that relationships of homogeneity, filiation, reciprocal explanation, authentication, or of common utilization were established among them. So let's talk for a second about this in relationship to Hippocrates. Hippocrates, the kind of semi-legendary founder of Greek medicine. So many texts, there's something called the Hippocratic corpus, are all of these texts that are associated with Hippocrates. In the ancient world, people would associate texts with authors' names, and no one would really, sometimes they would, but oftentimes people recognize that this was not written by Hippocrates as a historical individual. That wasn't even what they didn't really care about that. They were just saying that these texts belong to a certain kind of tradition. And then they get read together. They get used for the same purposes, and so therefore they belong to the same corpus or body of works. And so the author's name can function as organizing texts, not totally arbitrarily, but with some kind of reason of what these texts mean, how they're used, how we make them true, various kinds of things. Finally, the author's name characterizes a particular manner of existence of discourse. Discourse that possesses an author's name is not to be immediately consumed and forgotten. That's kind of interesting. It goes back to that thing we were saying about death. Like, well, there's someone who's an author, we kind of remember their thing. Well, what would be something that doesn't have an author's name? Well, we could just go back with ChatGPT. These things are being constantly produced, and no one kind of, is going to publish them, I don't think. Maybe eventually someone will, trying to make an author out of ChatGPT, being like, the best of ChatGPT, 2040 edition, and be like, send in your best ChatGPT. Maybe there'll be like a contest for this kind of thing in the future. I don't know. Maybe it would then start to function as an author. But right now, we don't remember these things. There's lots of stuff that just circulates without an author's name, and that stuff usually ends up being more temporary, more fleeting. You can think about jokes. Certain jokes that are kind of anonymous. They're fun, they're memorable, but you don't say, oh, who authored that joke? If a joke is authored, like from a stand-up comedian or from a show, it has a different kind of valence. It has a different kind of circulation and humor associated with it. Rather, its status and its matter of reception are regulated by the culture in which it circulates. We can conclude that unlike a proper name, which moves from the interior of a discourse to the real person outside who produced it, the name of the author remains at the contours of text, separating one from the other, defining their form, and characterizing their mode of existence. It points to the existence of certain groups of discourse and refers to the status of this discourse within a society and a culture. And status might be good or bad. It's just like, well, where does it fall? How do we relate to this? This kind of thing, this kind of discourse that we're reading. The author's name is not a function of a man's civil status, nor is it fictional. It is situated in the breach, among the discontinuities, which give rise to new groups of discourse and their singular mode of existence. So if you go into a bookstore, remember those? You go into a bookstore and you kind of see these different markings, or into a library, and they'd be like, well, here's the kind of fiction section, and there's subdivisions of that. There's science fiction, and now there's also classics and literature. These are, in some sense, in a very simple way, divisions within discourse. Because all of these are books, all of these are texts, but we divide them up. And we have different relationships to them. We have different expectations of them. If I go and I get a piece of literature, I begin at the beginning, and I kind of move my way through it, usually. That's the usual way of doing it. Whereas if I get a textbook, it would be kind of weird to read a textbook cover to cover. I mean, you might do that as a kind of sign of how studious you are. But most of the time, you're going to use like a reference work or a textbook by going to a certain entry. That the book will kind of be organized within itself in a different way in relationship to what it's supposed to be used for, which might not be pleasure, like we might think of the use of literature now. We think of it as we use it for pleasure. That wasn't always the case. Consequently, we can say that our culture, the name of an author is a variable that accompanies only certain texts to the exclusion of others. A private letter may have a signatory, but it does not have an author. A contract can have an underwriter, but not an author. And similarly, an anonymous poster attached to a wall may have a writer, but he cannot be an author. In this sense, the function of an author is to characterize the existence, circulation, and operation of certain discourses within a society. I think that this is one of the better parts of this piece. And I think what could help it is if you just think of all the other moments of, and we can just stay with written discourse, that you would say, okay, there's clearly someone that wrote this, but would we be able to say the words and feel it not be weird to say that it has an author? So you might just think about texts that you send. Did I author them when I send someone a DM? It doesn't seem right to say that I'm the author of that. And you might think about why. Why does it not feel that way? And that will hopefully give you a sense of what authorship might be doing here. His idea is that it characterizes a certain kind of existence, circulation, and operation of a discourse. An authored discourse functions differently than an unauthored discourse. In dealing with the author as a function of discourse, we must consider the characteristics of a discourse that support this use and determine its difference from other discourses. If we limit our remarks to only those books or texts with authors, we can isolate 4 different features. And so now he's going to say, okay, I've been talking about the author function. We've gone from the author, we've said that the author is kind of a weird thing. It does these weird things with death and blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, let's look at it as a function. That space that we can see even better now because the author is dead. All right, now that we have talked about the author function and we've shown that that isn't just kind of a universal thing that all written discourse has, what is the author function? Here are 4 features, all right? This is where we are in the text. First, they are objects of appropriation. This word has kind of become a popular negative meaning today. It doesn't here, I think, have a necessarily negative meaning. proprium or property, all of these things have to do with things that you possess or that are your own. The form of property they have become is of a particular type whose legal codification was accomplished some years ago. It is important to notice as well that its status as property is historically secondary to the penal code controlling its appropriation. So, what's he talking about here? We might think about intellectual property. That's maybe a bit too narrow to really capture all of the meanings that it could have. But for instance, you might author something and you might not see any profit from it. But if somebody else tries to use it and sell it, you might be able to sue them and get their profits for yourself. So this might have something to do with the question of appropriation and property here. It's not necessarily that it's that it controls who is able to appropriate this discourse. And plagiarism, like in college classes, is a great example of this. Someone has authored something just because they've said it, or they've written it down somewhere. But now if you've tried to say it, no good. You're not allowed to do that. That has been authored. So therefore, you need to respect the authority of that text by citing it or quoting it and showing that it's not yours, that you have not authored that piece of discourse. Speeches and books were assigned real authors, other than mythical or important religious figures, only when the author became subject to punishment, and to the extent that his discourse was considered transgressive, which is an interesting historical claim. I wonder if this would really hold up to deep historical analysis, but anyway, that's what he's saying. In our culture, undoubtedly in others as well, discourse was not originally a thing, a product, or a possession, but an action situated in a bipolar field of sacred and profane, lawful and unlawful, religious and blasphemous. It was a gesture charged with risks long before it became a possession caught in a circuit of property values. But it was at the moment when a system of ownership and strict copyright rules were established, toward the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, that the transgressive properties always intrinsic to the act of writing became the forceful imperative of literature. It is as if the author, at the moment he was accepted into the social order of property which governs our culture, was compensating for his new status by reviving the older bipolar field of discourse in a systematic practice of transgression, and by restoring the danger of writing, which, on the other hand, had been conferred the benefits of property. There's a lot going on there, and it's probably not going to be possible for me to make it all clear. For one reason, that it's not all clear to me. But you might think of it this way, something like this. In this moment, like the early 19th century, when the kind of figure of the author starts to become a kind of social type. In England, Grub Street and London was associated with this. So in the late 18th century, figures like Samuel Johnson are people who start to be able to live by the pen, as they say. You can be a professional writer. Why? Well, for lots of different reasons. There's all sorts of different periodicals you can kind of write regularly, and you can get paid for your words. It's at the same time where that social figure of the professional writer emerges, that writing also kind of takes on a new kind of dangerous quality to it, based on the fact that someone might be commenting on society, might be criticizing society in a new and distinctive way. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened, obviously. The political and religious wars of Europe were totally enmeshed in all these pamphlet wars and things that people were writing and blah, 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 blah. But there's a different kind of, let's say, attitude towards the danger that someone's producing, of saying, well, that person is putting forward a dangerous idea. And so in order to control for that possibility of the professional writer who might put forward dangerous ideas, we need to know who they are. And so authorship functions as a kind of way of being able to hold people accountable for their speech or their writing. Secondly, the author function is not universal or constant in all discourse. Even within our civilization, the same types of texts have not always required authors. There was a time when those texts, which we now call literary, stories, folktales, epics, and tragedies, were accepted, circulated, and valorized without any question about the identity of their author. Their anonymity was ignored because their real or supposed age was a sufficient guarantee of their authenticity. So I really like these. I grew up listening to these stories these Cherokee stories about how rabbit tricked otter and other stories, these animal stories. These stories are traditional stories, and of course the telling of those stories maybe modifies them or changes them in certain important ways, in certain important contexts, especially now in this day, and talking to people who, and it's not happening in the original language. But you couldn't really ask someone to be like, well, who wrote the story, How Rabbit Tricked Otter? That story circulated in an oral culture for many years where authorship didn't have, there wasn't a sense that someone could own a story. It wasn't a thing you could own. Texts, however, that we now call scientific, dealing with cosmology and the heavens, medicine or illness, the natural sciences or geography, were only considered truthful during the Middle Ages if the name of the author was indicated. So he's kind of showing that we've done a Uno reverse here, where today we think of authors, we think of literary texts. In the past, those were the ones that were definitely without authors. Today, you think of kind of scientific discoveries or things like that, and you're like, well, that's just the truth. But in the past, you had to be like, well, who wrote it down? And there were these auctores, or authors, that you would have to always say. As he says here, statements on the order of Hippocrates said, or Pliny tells us that, were not merely formulas for an argument based on authority. They marked a proven discourse. In the 17th and 18th century, a totally new conception was developed when scientific texts were accepted on their own merits and positioned within an anonymous and coherent conceptual system of established truths and methods of verification. Authentication no longer required reference to the individual who had produced them. The role of the author disappeared as an index of truthfulness, and where it remained as an inventor's name, it was merely to denote a specific theorem or proposition, a strange effect, a property, a body, a group of elements, or pathological syndrome. So, you might have Tourette's, right? But whoever Tourette's was historically, it doesn't really matter. We don't really care that much. I mean, you might take an academic interest in that, but that's not like what proves it to exist. It's the field of medicine itself, the field of discourse, of physiology, anatomy. These are the things, the discourses that make things true, not the authors themselves. The authors of those scientific papers can have their work verified within the discourse, and maybe they get prizes or awards for it, but it isn't their name that continues to make it true for us. At the same time, however, literary discourse was acceptable only if it carried an author's name. Every text of poetry or fiction was obliged to state its author and date, place, and circumstance of its writing. The meaning and value attributed to the text depended on this information. If by accident or design a text was presented anonymously, every effort was made to locate its author. So this is a really interesting argument, and I think that even then, though he's talking in kind of broad historical strokes, there is some historical truth to this. That at a certain point, when a text was anonymous, in the 17th or 18th century, it would then maybe even say anonymous on it. And so you would say, okay, well, now we have this kind of position of the author, the function of the author, be like, well, who is the person that wrote it? Which is a question you might ask and seriously pursue, or the police might pursue, or whatever. You might try to figure it out. In fact, that's something that textual scholars continue to do today. They try to take anonymous works and figure out who really wrote them. Oftentimes because they're like, it's probably a woman who wasn't allowed to publish, so we're going to figure out who she was, or something like that. Literary anonymity was of interest only as a puzzle to be solved, as in our day, literary works are totally dominated by the sovereignty of the author. Undoubtedly, these remarks are far too categorical. Criticism has been concerned for some time now with aspects of a text not fully dependent on the notion of an individual creator. Studies of genre or the analysis of recurring textual motifs and their variations form a norm other than the author. Furthermore, where in mathematics the author has become little more than a handy reference for a particular theorem or group of propositions, like an abelian group, it's like they're just names for things. Who those people were that the names are after, it doesn't really matter that much for the functioning of mathematics to continue. The reference to an author in biology and medicine or to the date of his research has a substantially different bearing. This latter reference, more than simply indicating the source of information, attests to the reliability of the evidence, since it entails an appreciation of the techniques and experimental materials available at a given time and in a particular laboratory. So basically what he's doing here in the parentheses is he's qualifying the argument that he's just made. He's like, okay, yes, there was Uno reverse between literature and science and which ones had to be authored discourses, but it's also not that simple, because in mathematics, is still different than biology. Like who came up with the idea in biology, it does matter if it's pre-Darwin or not. Whereas in mathematics, an Euler or even Euclid or something, this could still be just as kind of legitimate. We don't have to. The Pythagorean theorem isn't any less mathematically sound because it's ancient or anything like that. So okay, he's just pointing out some of the qualifications to his own argument. The third point concerning this author function is that it is not formed spontaneously through the simple attribution of a discourse to an individual. It results from a complex operation whose purpose is to construct the rational entity we call an author. Undoubtedly, this construction is assigned a realistic dimension as we speak of an individual's profundity or creative power, his intentions, or the original is inspiration manifested in writing. Nevertheless, these aspects of an individual, which we designate as an author, are projections, in terms always more or less psychological, of our way of handling texts. In the comparisons we make, the traits we extract as pertinent, the continuities we assign, or the exclusions we practice. In addition, all these operations vary according to the period and the form of discourse concerned. A philosopher and a poet are not constructed in the same manner, and the author of an 18th century novel was formed differently from the modern novelist. So this is kind of hard to read if you're thinking here in the terms that he's trying to break apart. Be like, what do you mean a philosopher and a poet are not constructed in the same manner? They're both born, aren't they? He's like, no. I'm talking about constructing a philosopher. Yeah, we say the philosopher did all of these things in their life, right? We're interested in how they came upon their ideas in a certain way. And there's a genre to how we do that. There's a kind of discursive construct of the life of a philosopher, as opposed to how we tell the story of a life of a poet, which shows that we're making a distinction between poet and philosopher in the function of an author function, before any particular individual gets involved, before there are any facts to be there. So it might be very relevant in telling the life of a poet. What kind of poetry were they read? Whether they loved their mother or something like that. Whereas with a philosopher, people might be more interested in what their relationship was to a series of older philosophical arguments. So these are some of the differences. I don't know. That's maybe not the best example, but that's what he gave us. So, in literary criticism, for example, the traditional methods for defining an author, or rather for determining the configuration of the author from existing texts, derive in large part from those used in the Christian tradition to authenticate or to reject the particular text in its possession. So what does it mean to authenticate or reject? Well, in Christianity, as in many other religious traditions, but certainly here this is the major one to consider for what he's talking about, certain texts were canonized. They became part of the Bible. I mean, there are other canons too, but they're parts of the Bible. Well, there are lots of religious texts floating around. And then people had to get together and say, well, which of these are sacred? Which of these are part of the Bible and part of God's word, and which are not? And that process that they went through to kind of make those determinations, he's saying, we still kind of live with that basic idea. Modern criticism and its desire to recover the author from a work employs devices strongly reminiscent of Christian exegesis, when it wished to prove the value of a text by ascertaining the holiness of its author. So one thing that happens here is that very often when people are trying to make an argument that, let's say, Shakespeare wrote some work that's not usually attributed to him, they'll do stylistic analysis and be like, look, this style is really good and similar to Shakespeare's, so he might have written it. But more often I see this kind of thing happening in textual and philological analysis. And often I think quite persuasively, where someone will say, look, the style of this piece is really bad. This can't be the same guy who wrote King Lear. This cannot be that same guy. It's like not very good. So in the Bible, for instance, St. John is said to have written the book of Apocalypse or Revelation and the Gospel. So there's a tradition in which St. John the Evangelist, the guy who wrote the Gospel, named after St. John, was the same guy who wrote the book of Revelation. And then people who read Greek can read these and be like, these are absolutely clearly not the same person. Because the book of Revelation, the Greek in that is really bad. Like it's kind of not particularly grammatical. It's like, I got a very rough style. It's about as different stylistically as two texts could be, whereas the Gospel of John has this like very beautiful literary rhetorical quality to it. So stylistically, they're so different that they must be two different authors. In De Viris Illustribus, St. Jerome maintains that homonymy, words that are the same, is not proof of the common authorship of several works, since many individuals could have the same name. Okay, here literally the same name, not just of words, but the same name of individuals. Since many individuals could have the same name, or someone could have perversely appropriated another's name, like John, as I've just said. The name as an individual mark is not sufficient as it relates to a textual tradition. How, then, can several texts be attributed to an individual author? What norms related to the function of the author will disclose the involvement of several authors? According to St. Jerome, there are 4 criteria, just like Foucault has 4 criteria. The texts must be eliminated from the list of works attributed to a single author. Are those inferior to the others? Thus, the author is defined as a standard level of quality. Those whose ideas conflict with the doctrine expressed in the others. Hence, the author is defined as a certain field of conceptual or theoretical coherence. You're not allowed to if you're contradicting yourself in 2 different works, well, then that's not you. Wait a minute. Am I not contradicting myself in different works? I think I do that sometimes. Those written in a different style and containing words and phrases not ordinarily found in the other works. The author is seen as stylistic uniformity. That's kind of the example I was just giving about St. John. And those referring to events or historical figures subsequent to the death of the author. The author is thus a definite historical figure in which a series of events converge. Like, he couldn't have written this, he was dead, so that therefore the author is a historical person. Although modern criticism does not appear to have the same suspicions concerning authentication, its strategies for defining the author present striking similarities. The author explains the presence of certain events within a text, as well as their transformations, distortions, and their various modifications. And this through an author's biography or by reference to his particular point of view in the analysis of his social preferences and his position within a class, or by delineating his fundamental objectives. The author also constitutes a principle of unity in writing where any unevenness of production is ascribed to changes caused by evolution, maturation, or outside influence. So this is very common when people talk about major authors today. This is all over the stuff that I'm always looking at. Where people will talk about, let's say, today you might say like, oh, I'm in my Fleabag era. Okay, so we do this with authors too. We say, well, here's your early work and your late work have a different kind of unity. The early Marx, the middle Marx, and the late Marx. Or the early Heidegger, and the middle Heidegger, and the late Heidegger. Right? Oftentimes it's 2 or 3 different kind of phases where people have distinguished within one author's work periods. And there's some kind of change that's often narrated through biography. Oh, well, after the 1848 revolutions, Marx had a kind of new understanding of his work. And, after he had studied the British economists more deeply, his work matured in a certain way. Whatever it is, whatever it might be. There's a biographical kind of explanation given to a change in the work, but nevertheless, the author continues to function as a unity with this division inside of it. In addition, the author serves to neutralize the contradictions that are found in a series of texts. Governing this function is the belief that there must be, at a particular level of an author's thought, of his conscious and unconscious desire, a point where contradictions are resolved, where the incompatible elements can be shown to relate to one another, or to cohere around a fundamental and originating contradiction. Finally, the author is a particular source of expression who, in more or less finished forms, is manifested equally well and with similar validity in a text, in letters, fragments, drafts, and so forth. That one's actually a pretty interesting one to think about, like, when we have fragmentary parts of a work. Let's say the fragments of Sappho, the Greek poet. She was, a very celebrated poet in the ancient world, which is especially remarkable because the Greeks were pretty misogynistic. So, and usually when they praised her, like, she was very manly. That's why they liked her. But we have most of the things that we have from Sappho are entirely in fragments. We have a few words. So people who have tried to reconstruct her work have often tried to look at the more complete parts of what we have from her, and then imagine that the fragments can be reconstructed with similarities of style or diction, or the same kind of vocabulary and meter. And that might be a very good guess as to what they were. I don't know. But that shows you how the author function works, to say, okay, well, we have these fragments that must be from Sappho, so they must be similar in some way to the other ones that we have from her. However, it would be false to consider the function of the author as pure and simple reconstruction after the fact of a text, given as passive material, since a text always bears a number of signs that refer to the author. Well known to grammarians, these textual signs are personal pronouns, adverbs of time and place, and the conjugation of verbs. But it is important to note that the elements have a different bearing on texts with an author and on those without one. In the latter, these shifters, so in the latter here means on the text with an author. So in text with an author, these shifters, these pronouns, things that's like I, you, they, we, refer to a real speaker and to an actual deictic situation. The deictic situation is the one where all the pronouns take on meaning. Be like, go get that for me. Well, the word that doesn't have any meaning, but deictically it does because the word that has meaning, but the deictic reference of the word that is defined by its context of speaking and saying. So in a text that has an author, there's an actual deictic situation with certain exceptions, such as the case of indirect speech in the first person. We're going to ignore these complexities. When discourse is linked to an author, however, the latter. This is the former. So that was in the ones without an author. That's how it is. In the former, when it is linked to an author, the role of shifters is more complex and variable. That makes more sense. It is well known that in a novel narrated in the first person, neither the first person pronoun, the present indicative tense, nor for that matter its signs of localization refer directly to the writer, either to the time when he wrote or to the specific act of writing. So when Moby Dick begins, call me Ishmael, who's me? Well, Ishmael. Who's Ishmael? Well, it's not Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. That seems very obvious, but it's like, well, what then is it referring to? In a fictional work, we might kind of dodge the question by saying something like, well, it refers to a fictional world, and we kind of just get rid of it. But what about when someone's writing a non-fictional text? We have a similar kind of problem, where someone's like referring to themselves. Are they, as an author, referring to their real historical self, like at the moment at which they're writing it? That is not going to hold up to analysis. Rather, they stand for a second self, whose similarity to the author is never fixed and undergoes considerable alteration within the course of a single book. It would be as false to seek the author in relation to the actual writer as to the fictional narrator. The author function arises out of their scission, their splitness, in the division and distance of the two. One might object that this phenomenon only applies to novels or poetry, to a context of quasi-discourse, as I was just saying about the fictional world thing. But in fact, all discourse that supports this author function is characterized by this plurality of egos. In a mathematical treatise, the ego who indicates the circumstances of composition in the preface is not identical either in terms of his position or function to the I who concludes a demonstration within the body of the text. The former implies a unique individual who, at a given time and place, succeeded in completing a project, whereas the latter indicates an instance in a plan of demonstration that anyone could perform, provided the same set of axioms, preliminary operations, and an identical set of symbols were used. So, someone who's writing a kind of geometry textbook might be like, I dedicate this book to my mom. Okay, well, their I refers to one kind of ego, one kind of person. If they're like, I draw a line from point A to point B, then I do this. Well, that I could be anyone. It's not really the same person that dedicated the book to their mom. That's the point that he's making here. And you might disagree with that, but I actually think that I would say I agree with Foucault's argument here. But we can argue about it. You can put something in the chat, by the way, if you're here. If you're already 90 minutes into this piece. I think we'll finish it, but it might take like another 30 minutes, I think. So feel free to drop something in the chat if you are listening along and you're like, I don't know about that. It is also possible to locate a third ego, one who speaks of the goals of his investigation, the obstacles encountered, its results, and the problems yet to be solved, and this I would function in a field of existing or future mathematical discourses. We are not dealing with a system of dependencies where a first and essential use of the I is reduplicated as a kind of fiction by the other two. On the contrary, the author function in such discourses operates so as to effect the simultaneous dispersion of the three egos. Further elaboration would, of course, disclose other characteristics of the author function, but I've limited myself to the four that seemed most obvious and important. They could be summarized in the following manner. The author function is tied to the legal and institutional systems that circumscribe, determine, and articulate the realm of discourses. 2. It does not operate in a uniform manner in all discourses at all times and in any given culture. 3. It is not defined by the spontaneous attribution of a text to its creator, but through a series of precise and complex procedures. Okay. 4. It does not refer purely and simply to an actual individual insofar as it simultaneously gives rise to a variety of egos and to a series of subjective positions that individuals of any class may come to occupy. So those are his 4 things. He's like, what do I mean when I say author function as opposed to author? These are the things I mean. I'm aware that until now I have kept my subject within unjustifiable limits. I should also have spoken of the author function in painting, music, technical fields, and so forth. Admitting that my analysis is restricted to the domain of discourse, it seems that I have given the term author an excessively narrow meaning. What about the author of a film? Who would be the author of a film? In the French film theory, where actually an early version of this was published in the journal Screen, which is one of the places where they developed the auteur theory of cinema, which is French for kind of author. Who was the auteur? It's always the director. Well, why not the writer? Why not the actors? Why not the cinematographer? That's a very interesting question, and Foucault's like, yeah, but I'm not dealing with that. So why am I not dealing with that? However, it is obvious that even within the realm of discourse, a person can be the author of much more than a book, of a theory, for instance, of a tradition or a discipline, within which new books and authors can proliferate. For convenience, we could say that such authors occupy a trans-discursive position. So he's like, on the one hand, I'm not going to be able to deal with all of these other ways that you can be an author, but there is one other way you can be an author that's really important, which is that you're not the author of just a work or a book, but of a tradition, of a discourse. Homer, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers played this role, as did the first mathematicians and the originators of the Hippocratic tradition. This type of author is surely as old as our civilization. But I believe that the 19th century in Europe produced a singular type of author who should not be confused with great literary authors or the authors of canonical religious texts and the founders of sciences. Somewhat arbitrarily, we might call them initiators of discursive practices. The distinctive contribution of these authors is that they produce not only their own work, but the possibility and the rules of formation of other texts. In this sense, their role differs entirely from that of a novelist, for example, who is basically never more than an author of his own text. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think that there are certain authors who put forward examples or models of how to write a text in the text that they write. But okay, I'm not going to argue with Foucault right now. Freud is not simply the author of the interpretation of dreams or of wit and its relation to the unconscious, and Marx is not simply the author of the Communist Manifesto or Capital. They both established the endless possibility of discourse. You can be a Freudian, you can be a Marxian or a Marxist. And that's different from, I can't be a Balzacian, I can't be a Nabokovian, in the sense that I can't participate in their discourse. I can read their books, too, just like I can read Marx and Freud, but I can't be in their discourse other than by reading their books. It might be one simple way to understand it. Obviously, an easy objection can be made. The author of a novel may be responsible for more than his own text. If he acquires some importance in the literary world, his influence can have significant ramifications. To take a very simple example, one could say that Anne Radcliffe did not simply write The Mysteries of Udolpho and a few other novels. So this is often used as an example of beginning of the Gothic genre, but also made possible. He says it. But also made possible the appearance of Gothic romances at the beginning of the 19th century. To this extent, her function as an author exceeds the limits of her work. However, he's anticipating our objection. This objection can be answered by the fact that the possibilities disclosed by the initiators of discursive practices, using the examples of Marx and Freud, whom I believe to be the first and the most important, are significantly different from those suggested by novelists. The novels of Anne Radcliffe put into circulation a certain number of resemblances and analogies patterned on her own work, various characteristic signs, figures, relationships, and structures that could be integrated into other books. In short, to say that Anne Radcliffe created the Gothic romance means that there are certain elements common to her works and to the 19th century Gothic romance. The heroine ruined by her own innocence, the secret fortress that functions as a counter-city, the outlaw hero who swears revenge on the world that has cursed him, etc. On the other hand, Marx and Freud, as initiators of discursive practices, not only made possible a certain number of analogies that could be adopted by future texts, but as importantly, they also made possible a certain number of differences. They cleared a space for the introduction of elements other than their own, which nevertheless remain within the field of discourse they initiated. So this is going to be hard to understand unless you're already kind of deep into thinking about psychoanalysis or Marxism. But we'll try to work through the example that he gives here. In saying that Freud founded psychoanalysis, we do not simply mean that the concept of libido or the techniques of dream analysis reappear in the writings of Carl Abraham or Melanie Klein, two famous psychoanalysts after Freud, but that he made possible a certain number of differences with respect to his books, concepts, and hypotheses, which all arise out of psychoanalytic discourse. So, in some sense, you might say that, like, the fact that psychoanalysis can have different schools, that you could become an ego psychologist, you could become literally a Kleinian. There are Kleinian psychoanalysts that follow the work of Melanie Klein. That there are kind of controversies within the discourse of psychoanalysis sets it out as being different from just a genre of discourse, like the Gothic romance or something like that. So the differences in a Gothic romance within the genres, they don't compete with one another. They're just differences. They're just kind of interesting variations. But the differences that exist within psychoanalysis or Marxism produce something like controversies. Now, that's not what Foucault is saying. That's my interpretation of it, and I'm sticking to it. Is this not the case, however, with the founder of any new science or of any author who successfully transforms an existing science? After all, Galileo is indirectly responsible for the texts of those who mechanically applied the laws he formulated. Except he wasn't Galileo, it was Kepler. But okay, we're not getting into that debate either. In addition to having paved the way for the production of statements far different from his own. If Cuvier is the founder of biology and Saussure of linguistics, it is not because they were imitated or that an organic concept or theory of the sign was uncritically integrated into new texts, but because Cuvier, to a certain extent, made possible a theory of evolution diametrically opposed to his own system. And because Saussure made possible a generative grammar radically different from his own structural analysis. Superficially, then, the initiation of discursive practices appears similar to the founding of any scientific endeavor, but I believe there is a fundamental difference. In a scientific program, the founding act is on equal footing with its future transformations. Now, it is merely one among many modifications that make it possible. I think Foucault is totally full of shit on this. I don't think this is true at all. I don't think that the founding act of a science is, even in the kind of most traditional renderings of how scientific practice works, is seen as being on an equal footing with all future transformations of it. I think, if anything, science represents its own discourse as always being progressive, and so that the founding act is always kind of inevitably a mistake. It always kind of gets something wrong because it kind of gets improved in the future. So I really disagree strongly with Foucault on this point, but now that I've said that, I'm just going to continue reading what he wrote. This interdependence can take several forms. In the future development of a science, the founding act may appear as little more than a single instance of a more general phenomenon in which it has been discovered. It might be questioned in retrospect for being too intuitive or empirical and submitted to the rigors of new theoretical operations in order to situate it in a formal domain. Finally, it might be thought a hasty generalization whose validity should be restricted. In other words, the founding act of a science can always be rechanneled through the machinery of transformations it has instituted. Okay, well, let's just keep... I don't want to argue. I keep saying that I don't want to, and then I keep trying to argue with Foucault. On the other hand, the initiation of a discursive practice is heterogeneous to its ulterior transformations. To extend psychoanalytic practice, as initiated by Freud, is not to presume a formal generality that was not claimed at the outset. It is to explore a number of possible applications. To limit it is to isolate in the original text a small set of propositions or statements that are recognized as having an inaugurative value that mark other Freudian concepts or theories as derivative. And here, derivative doesn't mean bad. It means that, like, okay, these other concepts, the concept, let's say Melanie Klein has a concept of splitting or Spaltung that she developed, that the infant, that's when they're being nursed at the breast, they have a kind of pleasurable reaction to being nursed, and then the breast is taken away and they're upset. And so they split the good mother that possesses the breast from the bad mother that takes it away. They think there's two different individuals, basically. Melanie Klein can situate that concept of splitting and derive it out of other kind of Freudian concepts in her work, even though it is nevertheless a new concept. And also clinical observation and child analysis and things like that. But in the status of psychoanalysis, part of Foucault's argument, I think, is to say that one needs to be able to kind of derive these differences from the inaugurative moment, to be able to show that in some way. Finally, there are no false statements in the work of these initiators. Those statements considered inessential or prehistoric, in that they are associated with another discourse, are simply neglected in favor of the more pertinent aspects of the work. The initiation of a discursive practice, unlike the founding of a science, overshadows and is necessarily detached from its later developments and its transformations. As a consequence, we define the theoretical validity of a statement with respect to the work of the initiator, whereas in the case of Galileo or Newton, it is based on the structural and intrinsic forms established in cosmology or physics. Stated schematically, the work of these initiators is not situated in relation to a science or in the space it defines. Rather, it is science or discursive practice that relate to their works as the primary points of reference. Okay, I want to give Foucault credit here for something. You will notice if you ever kind of meet in the wild someone who's pretty devoted to psychoanalysis or Marxist discourse, for instance, that if you listen to people in that world long enough, you might hear that there's kind of some tension and disagreement, and one way that they might try to patch that over is by referring back to the works of Marx and Engels or to Freud. I think that at least today, those traditions definitely have a lot more people that are kind of less attached to the sacred quality of those founding texts than before. But I think it is still distinctive. You will still see people trying to make those kinds of arguments cohere. Try to make an interpretation that would make this tradition coherent in a way that I do think is distinct from lots of scientific practices, that the way that things have to kind of cohere is not back to a founding text. That might be true. But I think Foucault, as he often does, overstates the case by putting it in these terms. But whatever. In keeping with this distinction, we can understand why it is inevitable that practitioners of such discourses must return to the origin. Here, as well, it is necessary to distinguish a return from scientific rediscoveries or reactivations. And one thing I recognize now is having found out that Lacan was in the audience, and Lacan actually points this out in his question. This might be a little bit of a subtweet to Jacques Lacan, who had kind of famously announced that he was making a return to Freud. And even though he is kind of like radically reinterpreting Freud, being like, okay, well, why do you need to return to Freud if you're going to change him? Why do it in those terms? So this is in some sense maybe what Foucault is picking on here. Rediscoveries are the effects of analogy or isomorphism with current forms of knowledge that allow the perception of forgotten or obscured figures. For instance, Chomsky, in his book on Cartesian grammar, rediscovered a form of knowledge that had been in use from Cordemoy to Humboldt. It could only be, this is linguistics, sort of. It could only be understood that the perspective of generative grammar because this later manifestation held the key to its construction. In effect, a retrospective codification of an historical position. Reactivation refers to something quite different, the insertion of discourse into totally new domains of generalization, practice, and transformations. The history of mathematics abounds in examples of this phenomenon, as the work of Michel Serres on mathematical anamnesis shows. The phrase "return to" designates a movement with its proper specificity, which characterizes the initiation of discursive practices. If we return, it is because of a basic and constructive omission, an omission that is not the result of accident or incomprehension. In effect, the act of initiation is such, in its essence, that it is inevitably subjected to its own distortions. That which displays this act and derives from it is, at the same time, the root of its divergences and travesties. This non-accidental omission must be regulated by precise operations that can be situated, analyzed, and reduced in a return to the act of initiation. The barrier imposed by omission was not added from the outside. It arises from the discursive practice in question, which gives it its law. Both the cause of the barrier and the means for its removal, this omission, also responsible for the obstacles that prevent returning to the act of initiation, can only be resolved by return. This is some dense, abstract prose, and I have to say, I'm not a fan of it. But I'm going to make my best interpretation here to try to tell you what I think he's doing. So if we go back to the idea of, even though he's distinguishing Marx and Freud from the earlier versions of the tradition, how some people would kind of deal with problems in law. You have a series of laws, and now a case emerges that like isn't addressed in the law. So, okay, you have the maybe a certain kind of right. You have a right to speak. Well, now we are able to speak online in ways that were not anticipated by the earlier law. And there are all sorts of kind of weird cases that come up. Well, how do we interpret the law in light of these new cases? We can't just say, well, now we need another law for this case, because the case has to kind of fit within the law. So we return to the law and reinterpret it to figure out in its omissions what it would have meant. What would the meaning of the law be in light of this particular case? This is what legal and constitutional interpretation is doing all of the time. And in these new discourses, that kind of idea of returning to figure out what was omitted in light of new cases or new things that emerge or new questions that people bring to the texts, this is what he's saying is this kind of initiation of a discursive practice. You kind of recognize that you're in a specific discourse at the moment that you're returning to the founding or original text or whatever it is that you're returning to. In addition, it is always a return to a text in itself, specifically to a primary and unadorned text with particular attention to those things registered in the interstices of the text, its gaps and absences. We return to those empty spaces that have been masked by omission or concealed in a false and misleading plenitude. In these rediscoveries of an essential lack, we find the oscillation of two characteristic responses. This point was made. You can't help seeing it if you know how to read. He's making fun of this position, I think, a little bit. Or inversely, no, that point is not made in any of the printed words in the text, but it is expressed through the words, in their relationships, and in the distance that separates them. It follows naturally that this return, which is part of the discursive mechanism, constantly introduces modifications, and that the return to a text is not a historical supplement that would come to fix itself upon the primary discursivity and redouble it in the form of an ornament which, after all, is not essential. Rather, is an effective and necessary means of transforming discursive practice. A study of Galileo's works could alter our knowledge of the history, but not the science of mechanics. Whereas a re-examination of the books of Freud or Marx can transform our understanding of psychoanalysis or Marxism. And in fact, I will say here, I think that probably the most interesting works within these traditions, psychoanalysis and Marxism, almost always do some version of this. Like, I'm going to go back and reread something that we've all read, but I'm going to reinterpret it in order to show that tradition, this very tradition, can mean something else. That gesture does kind of continue to operate. I recently was listening to a psychoanalyst, her name is Jamieson Webster, who was talking about, she wrote a book called Conversion. So conversion, hysteria was one of the diagnostic categories of psychoanalysis, where a repressed symptom that's symbolic kind of emerges on your body. You have a kind of bodily symptom. So the first thing she was trying to do is like, okay, well, the word hysteria, people react really negatively to it. Can we reread these texts through just the idea of conversion? I'm going to privilege the idea of conversion rather than hysteria. And then in more recent work, she's kind of been like, actually, what we do need the term hysteria, even though it does kind of like make people feel like it's always already misogynistic. And so she's kind of done a reinterpretation of some other classic psychoanalytic texts on hysteria, or that criticize hysteria, that use hysteria to show the problems that they have, but then also to try to reconstitute a use of the term hysteria for actually practicing psychoanalysts. So these kinds of gestures are commonly made in these discourses. A last feature of these returns is that they tend to reinforce the enigmatic link between an author and his works. A text has an inaugurative value precisely because it is the work of a particular author, and our returns are conditioned by this knowledge. The rediscovery of an unknown text by Newton, Isaac Newton, or Cantor, Georg Cantor, was a mathematician famous for his work with infinite numbers and infinite cardinal and ordinal numbers and various things like that, will not modify classical cosmology or group theory. And group theory, yeah. At most, it will change our appreciation of their historical genesis. Bringing to light, however, an outline of psychoanalysis, this is another text by Freud, to the extent that we recognize it as a book by Freud, can transform not only our historical knowledge, but the field of psychoanalytic theory, if only through a shift of accent or of the center of gravity. These returns, an important component of discursive practices, form a relationship between fundamental and mediate authors, which is not identical to that which links an ordinary text to its immediate author. So one of the things that people have done here is Freud published a number of case studies. One of them is a case study of Dora. And Freud doesn't come off particularly good in that case. Some people have tried to kind of save this case by reinterpreting it through another concept within psychoanalysis. So one of Freud's most important concepts is transference, which is that basically you fall in love with your psychoanalyst or you hate them. You take some kind of relationship from your past, usually your relationship to a parental figure, and you project it onto your analyst. But there's also countertransference. Well, the analyst also does this too. So some people have reread this case study and all of the weird things about it and saying, well, this is actually a beautiful example of Freud's countertransference. Yes, he gets a lot of things wrong, but that's exactly what we would predict or expect in light of the countertransference. And now we can read this text differently by seeing it in light of that. Okay. So even the kind of worst moments of an author can be kind of reclaimed through their own conceptuality. These remarks concerning the initiation of discursive practices have been extremely schematic. Good point. Especially with regard to the opposition I've tried to trace between this initiation and the founding of sciences. Well, that's the thing that annoyed me most. So at least he's aware of it. The distinction between the two is not readily discernible. Moreover, there is no proof that these two procedures are mutually exclusive. My only purpose in setting up this opposition, however, was to show that the author function, sufficiently complex at the level of a book or series of texts that bear a definite signature, has other determining factors when analyzed in terms of larger entities, groups of works, or entire disciplines. Unfortunately, there is a decided absence of positive propositions in this essay, as it applies to analytic procedures or directions for future research, but I ought at least to give the reasons why I attach such importance to a continuation of this work. Developing a similar analysis could provide the basis for a topology of discourse. So a topology being able to say, these different kinds of discourse, we could actually, delimit them in some way. And Foucault is obsessed with this, even though he's obsessed with the history of topology in some sense, but he's also kind of looking for a new one. He's very suspicious of topology that exists, but you can also see in his work that he's very desirous for it, which is one of the more French things about him. A topology of this sort can be adequately understood in relation to the grammatical features, formal structures, and objects of discourse, because there undoubtedly exist specific discursive properties or relationships that are irreducible to the rules of grammar and logic, and to the laws that govern objects. These properties require investigation if we hope to distinguish the larger categories of discourse. The different forms of relationships or non-relationships that an author can assume are evidently one of these discursive properties. This form of investigation might also permit the introduction of a historical analysis of discourse. Oh, really? Isn't that convenient? Perhaps the time has come to study not only the expressive value and formal transformations of discourse, but its mode of existence. The modifications and variations within a culture of modes of circulation, valorization, attribution, and appropriation. I started to read a book about this happening with songs in the French 18th century, where there were these kinds of ballads that people were singing, and then the police, literally the police, or what would be analogous to the police force today, tried to figure out who was writing these songs. So remember when he talked about the author function being linked to punishment, this was like a kind of history of the police trying to figure out who's writing these songs. So they were anonymous, non-authored ballads that had some kind of political function at the time that upset the king. And so then the emperor, I don't remember exactly. I don't remember the book that well. I have to go read it again. But by looking for authors, the police created an authored discourse of these songs and being able to kind of verify them. So that's a modification. That's like a historically specific, textual, but also evidentiarily based moment of transition of like from an anonymous discourse to an authored discourse. Partially at the expense of themes and concepts that an author places in his work, the author function could also reveal the manner in which discourse is articulated on the basis of social relationships. Is it not possible to re-examine as a legitimate extension of this kind of analysis the privileges of the subject? Clearly, in undertaking an internal and architectonic analysis of a work, whether it be a literary text, a philosophical system, or a scientific work, and in delimiting psychological and biographical references. Oh my gosh. Suspicions arise concerning the absolute nature and creative role of the subject. But the subject should not be entirely abandoned. Okay, when he's saying subject here, he doesn't mean like the subject of the discourse, the topic. He means the position from which one might speak or write, produce discourse, something like that. It should be reconsidered not to restore the theme of an originating subject, but to seize its functions, its intervention in discourse, and its system of dependencies. We should suspend the typical questions. How does a free subject penetrate the density of things and endow them with meaning? How does it accomplish its design by animating the rules of discourse from within? Rather, we should ask, under what conditions and through what forms can an entity like the subject appear in the order of discourse? What position does it occupy? What functions does it exhibit? What rules does it follow in each type of discourse? Today, we could answer these questions with ChatGPT. We could do it almost experimentally. We could, create different pieces of writing through ChatGPT and be like, well, how does the subject appear in this piece of writing? Because we know it's a large language model operating in the background, whatever that means. It's kind of a little bit unclear to some people how that operates to the point that they think that there's like a database of knowledge that it's drawing on, which is leading to some very bad and confused uses of large language models. But we know that there's some kind of large language model operating in the background. That's not an author. It can't be said to be an author. But we nevertheless might read a text from ChatGPT and see it as part of an authored discourse. It might remind us of one. We might expect there to be an author for a piece of writing such like this. So then we can ask these kinds of questions. What position does a subject occupy here? We can see it more clearly when we know that there isn't a historical, real personage involved in the writing. Anyway, in short, the subject and its substitutes must be stripped of its creative role and analyzed as a complex and variable function of discourse. So forget creativity. Stop trying to be like, wow, this text is so brilliant because someone's creative. Foucault's recommendation is to say, no, look at it more analytically and try to think about what the text does, how it functions in order to produce a subject. That's sort of, it might be one way to interpret what he's saying. The author, what I've called the author function, is undoubtedly one of the possible specifications of the subject. Only one of the possible. Considering past historical transformations, it appears that the form, the complexity, and even the existence of this function are far from immutable. We can easily imagine a culture where discourse would circulate without any need for an author. I think we actually can today, much more easily even than when he wrote this. Or spoke this. Discourses, whatever their status, form, or value, and regardless of our manner of handling them, would unfold in a pervasive anonymity. No longer the tiresome repetitions. Who is the real author? Have we proof of his authenticity and originality? What has he revealed of his most profound self in language? New questions will be heard. What are the modes of existence of this discourse? Where does it come from? How is it circulated? Who controls it? What placements are determined for possible subjects? Who can fulfill these diverse functions of the subject? Behind all these questions, we should hear little more than the murmur of indifference. What matter who's speaking? So that's it. This is this really famous piece of writing, at least in the Anglosphere, really famous piece of writing by Foucault. I think a lot of people read this in literary theory classes. If you took a class in literary theory in an American university, it's very likely that you would encounter this text. But I think that we might reread this text, as we just have today, in light of technological concerns about things like large language models. And maybe it would provoke kind of interesting responses and questions in relationship to that. One of the reasons why I assigned this piece, and I do like this piece, even though the more I reread it, I'm kind of starting to like it a little bit less. Not just for its kind of elliptical style that Foucault uses, but also for some of the... In some sense, I think I understand it a little bit better now, and I'm not sure I like all of the implications that might come from this position. But one of the things I do like about it is it allows us to just ask different and more questions. I don't think it's bad or wrong to be like, how's that person so creative? Like, what's that? I mean, I think it's kind of fun sometimes to think about, let's say, an author of creative work and say, well, what do they do? Like, what's their practice? Do they drink yerba mate in the morning and go for long walks? Or, what happened in their childhood? Like, there's nothing wrong with this, but it might not be the only way to understand or ask questions about a text. And I think that's when it becomes a problem. When we're reading something and we're trying to relate to a complex text, and our conversation or our thinking is just like, well, the only thing that this text can mean is what an author says about it. We're kind of missing something then. We're missing a little bit about what that idea of the author is doing, how it's already forming our understanding of the text. So this text can help us just get some critical distance from texts in general that are authored and from discourses that are authored, and ask other questions. Not that we can't think about authorship, actually that we should think about it a little bit more. So hopefully you enjoyed or got something out of this piece, which we did in about 2 hours. Not too bad for such a complex piece. If you are on YouTube and you're in the future from my point of view, those shifters are changing based on the time. But if you're in the future or your present moment and you have thoughts about this, please drop a comment right below the video. I hopefully will still exist in that same future with you, and I can respond there and we can have a conversation there too. And if you're in my classes, I extra encourage you to do that. All right. Until next time, thank you for coming to the stream. And I'll see you next time we all get together.